Welcome to the third episode of the Campaign School podcast, produced by the Academy of the Impossible as part of our larger mission to expand the participation in the political process. I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm joined by Seb Fox Allen. And this week we're going to look at political journalism, which has been a recurring subject both at our campaign school, but also some of our other academy events. And most recently at our YouTube school, we were joined by Andrew Coyne, who has courted a bit of controversy recently as he falsely predicted Wildrose party majority, and instead, of course, was wrong, as many of the pundits and pollsters were. And what's great about Andrew is he does have the humility to talk about what went wrong, and while admitting he got it wrong, it was interesting that he was still willing to defend the pollsters. And this is something, Seb, that you and I talked about last week. I'm curious, Seb, what you think about the dialogue that's been happening both in social media and the mainstream media around the state of political journalism, not just in terms of the Alberta election, but also leading up to the US presidential election, as it seems the internet puts this weird kind of lens on political journalism, whether fairly or not, that gets people really questioning both the craft and the general practice, professional and otherwise.
Well, I think it's clear that the internet is changing the way politics is being covered across North America. But I think we have a tendency to frame these diagnoses too narrowly within the field of political journalism. And in the process, we tend to blame reporters for having difficulty covering a field which I would say is becoming intrinsically difficult to cover.
You know, that's an interesting point. There is both, I think, a nostalgia at play as people age and think of the good old days, but at the same time, the reverse on the internet, a fetishization of all that's novel that makes us think that all the ways people have been doing things should be tossed out for new ways, that all political coverage should, say, be reduced to 140 characters at a time. Are we perhaps caught in a false dichotomy between old and new, when instead we should be tolerant of both forms in terms of its capacity to help the public get engaged in the political process?
Well, I think when we tend to talk about a crisis in the field of political journalism, we tend to be too focused on the profession itself. We're generally talking about things like the permanence of print media or the internet coming in and affronting existing business models. Well, I think the fundamental way in which the internet is changing the way politics is covered is that it's somewhat subverted the relationship between politicians, reporters, and citizens. I think the internet as a repository for information that can be accessed at any point and tends to make politicians more careful about what they say and what they do in public has created a dynamic in which risk, and specifically the defensive management of risk or the offensive leveraging of risk, is replacing the idea or the argument as the central currency of politics. And what that means is that politicians are becoming increasingly dependent on communications professionals who have unnecessarily inserted themselves in between politicians and journalists.
Well, and I think that's a great point, and we see that in terms of both the gotcha style of journalism, which, granted, is not exclusive to the online world, as we often associate Watergate and newspapers with certainly the political culture of the 70s and 80s. But I think we've entered a type of surrealism in the way that, as you described, the communication professionals have gotten in between the sort of traditional journalist and the traditional politician, to the point that it does sometimes get silly. In fact, this happened here in Canada with our own friend Dan Spearin coining the term Harper History on Twitter, which was in response to a rather weird communication tactic that the government seemed to employ as an attempt to pressure the NDP around the debate of Canada's role in Afghanistan. Do you want to elaborate a bit on what happened there?
Well, I think there's two very interesting things that are worth mentioning related to the Harper History hashtag. The first is that that tends to be the kind of story that people criticize political journalists for covering. Something that doesn't deal with the real issues and is somewhat comedic in tone. I actually think there is a role for that kind of journalism in the broader scope of political reporting. The other thing I think that was interesting was how effective that tactic was on behalf of the Conservative government. The result of what should have been a pretty testy debate about Canada's role in Afghanistan ended in a news cycle which Canadians might have learned a lot more about the history of the CCF than the future of Afghanistan.
I think that's where having the communication consultant sit between the politician and the journalist, or the politician and the public, can often backfire, because what we all know is that in the age of the internet, you can't really control the message. And maybe that's part of the lesson that journalists themselves are learning, that they're used to having the type of monopoly on knowledge. Let's say when it comes to punditry, when it comes to analyzing polls, that whether it was in the case of Alberta or in the case of the US, as there's such an increasing competition for political opinion, for political audiences, that perhaps the issue now is not one of getting it right or getting it wrong, but more responding to mistakes, responding to audiences, so that, you can, certainly from the comedic perspective, have the piss taken out of you without, making it look like you've, lost face in a really damaging way.
Well, and I think there will have to be a time when we'll have to have a discussion about whether political discourse that happens online by non-journalists does deserve a place within the canon of political journalism in Canada.
That's a good point, which I suspect a lot of media organizations are making modest efforts towards, in terms of the Your Voice initiatives, or using social media analytics to measure popular sentiment and what people are saying. But I think even further, it's an issue of elevating people to the same stage as traditional pundits and giving them the opportunity to share their perspective in a grounded and knowledgeable way. Which brings us back to, our final topic for today's podcast, which is the announcement by Elizabeth Whitmer that she's stepping down from the Ontario legislature, which is significant because it is a minority government, and it's by no means a safe Tory riding. That the Liberals certainly have an opportunity to win that back. And it's interesting the way that it's almost a non-story, that in fact it reflects that when you have more people participating in the process of political journalism, it doesn't always mean that you get things right. Have you had a chance to look at Steve Pakin's article and sort of see his response? And I'm curious if you could tie this into what Adam Vaughan was saying when he came to our campaign school.
Well, yes. So Steve Paikin wrote a very interesting blog post in which he essentially took the media and the amateur political class to task for implying that a reversal of that seat, say, going to the Ontario Liberal Party, would mean a majority government for Dalton McGuinty. Of course, in this case, a win for the Liberals there would mean a tie in the legislature, of which the Speaker, who is a Liberal, could break. But of course, the Speaker's powers are not so simple as yes or no on each vote. I think what the Post got right was it spoke to a cynicism both ways, both from political journalists to citizens, in that political journalists, in some sense, don't trust Canadians, and perhaps for good reason, to be fully informed about the ramifications of specific political events. On the other hand, there's a cynicism among the general population that political reporters aren't doing as good a job as they could in informing them about the issues at hand.
Which really comes back to our motivations for holding and organizing campaign school, that it's, irresponsible of us to complain about the participants and the process without actually putting our efforts into changing it. And I suspect part of that involves providing a framework for people like us and Dan Spearin and some of the other members to work on both finding the opportunities and the problems, that we can bring something new, that our participants can bring something new. So we certainly encourage listeners to join us each Sunday at the Academy of the Impossible for, a not so much a class, but a group that really wants to look critically at politics and find the ways in which we can all participate. Thanks again, Seb, for joining me this week. I'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Jesse.